difference between hearing and listening in a business context is the action you take.
What really matters with language and local traditions is what are we coordinating around? What is the task that we're trying to perform together here?
If you don't know the audience, lead with the story, land with the data. But if you know the audience and they're highly rational, well, then you start with the data and then you build a story around that.
Language is not the same as thought. You can think anything you want, but having words and having linguistic conventions is something that we're using in public. And using it in public means that we are coordinating, we're aligning with other people around some common goal.
In your book, Nick, you talk about agency and agency in terms of a man with a bike has got more agency than a man without a bike. And where you're talking about conversations sort of looking to complete a task or do something, then you get agency from teams. And that's where you are able to do more. So do you want to speak a little bit about that kind of agency and how you can create a group of people working together?
Of course, yeah. Agency. I don't recall the example of a man with a bike. Clearly, the man with the bike has more agency if his intention is to go far in a short time and he has a road. There are many ways in which a man with a bike would not have much advantage, depending on the place where you are and so forth. But it's a good example because it highlights that, whatever thing it is that's giving us an advantage is quite context specific. So bikes are great, but not in every context, right? It's like not underwater, for example. With language, agency is this amazing thing with humans. I mean, all creatures have agency in some sense, that you can act in the world and you can pursue your goals and so on. Species that cooperate, and humans are sort of the world leaders in this respect. Cooperation is really our forte, and language is the tool that we use to get it. And so what we're really doing when we're using language is getting others to take the same kind of perspective as we are taking, assume the same goals as we have. It's very practical. It's not just about, agreeing with each other, but, here's the goal that we have. We can describe that, we can define that in advance, and then we can use language to, guide the other and to announce to the other what role we're playing. It's a tool for kind of assuming the positions that we take in a cooperative enterprise and defining kind of that end goal in some sense, so that we know when we get to the end of it, just like going back to the example of telling a joke, or a tragic story or whatever. I've helped you, we've agreed, okay, we've got a certain goal in the end here. We know when we get to it. And so you can easily translate that to a business kind of context, that we've got a goal of this meeting, or we've got a goal of this particular enterprise, whatever it is. Language is what we use to frame that. And it's not an individual thing, right? If it was an individual thing, I wouldn't necessarily be using language. So what I'm trying to do is to align with others. I can be manipulating them, but hopefully I'm not. Hopefully this is a win-win for everybody. But that's really how the tool of language works.
Well, it's interesting. In your book, you were talking about this kind of cooperation leading to evolution. So without agency, are you losing out in evolution? Does that make sense? So where if I can align with other people, then I have legacy, I have family, I have all these things that will strengthen my position in the world. And if I don't align with other people, I have very little.
Well, I think that goes, well, maybe not goes without saying, but I think it's quite clear that, what we're trying to do is build, we're trying to, if you want to make the world a better place, you're not going to really be able to do it without working together with other people. And so part of that might be individually motivated by, thinking of one's legacy or what have you, and evolutionarily, you would make that argument with respect to your genetics or whatever. You leave more genes to the future. But in the realm of language, it's more about ideas, and it's about legacy of what we've been able to do together with other people. So I think it's a good way to think about it in terms of legacy is, if we're going to create action that has some kind of outcome, language is a tool that is going to bring others together in pursuing those actions.
And the opposite is true. If you want to move from create to destroy, put yourself in the most isolated situation you can be by yourself with a first-person shooter game, and spend a lot of time there where you desensitize yourself to other humans, and then have a poor interaction at school and use guns to destroy other human life, because the way they can express themselves has been so reduced that all of this creation that we just talked about in the broadest context, leaving your progeny on to the next generation, they can't even see that possibility. So in that environment where there is no language, in a first-person shooter game, there is shooting noise.
Yeah.
You might cheer yourself or whatever the case may be. But in that environment where you move from interacting and cooperating to groups to destroying other human life, that is the antithesis of it. That kind of shows that the absence of language can be as destructive as the creative impact of language in cooperation with others.
And that example shows also the distinction between brute reality and social reality. So, shooting is a great example of brute reality. That you have these reactions of force, and then they have consequences of force, and you can't stop a bullet by saying something to it. You
or
can't
pausing the game.
Yeah. So, but language is the thing that guides other people in making decisions, and
how they react to that. Like, do they perceive this person who was the shooter to be mistreated? So there's a sympathy there, or is the politics such that he had his Second Amendment rights or something? So that's where sort of the language versus reality thing.
Well, it depends again on what you're trying to achieve in any given moment. So, anytime you introduce a new angle on an example, oftentimes it is, we've now changed what we're trying to do here. So we could be having an argument about my right to shoot my gun or to play my, first-person shooter game. It's fun. I like it. It causes no harm. We're out of the context now of actually doing the game, and we're talking about whether it's a good thing to do or not, or whether I have a right to do it or not. But certain kinds of action, that's where it really does matter. So, for example, if I have some difference of opinion with you and it's bothering me, right? Well, we can deal with it a number of ways, and one way would be violence, and another way would be talking. And those would go in different directions, very obviously. But that's the beauty of talking, is that it's the great alternative to violence.
Yeah, and the corollary to that is that globally, first-person shooter games, as a cooperative enterprise, fill stadiums with ticket-paying public as well as betting public. And all these people are communicating real time as teams to achieve an outcome. The point is, when you're isolated and you have no language, your ability to cooperate and create in a society is diminished greatly. So we should figure out, how do we move that isolated individual into a context where they can use language to express their frustration or whatever it is that is going to cause the destruction.
So collaboration is the key to creation, creativity, evolution, and all of those things. And sometimes we talk about leaders, and sometimes that can lead to talk about egos and having a sense of this is what I want to happen, and this is what the people around me are going to help me achieve. But that's not cooperation necessarily. So cooperation would be discussing with people what a shared goal is. Is that, would that be fair enough to say?
Well, I think there are many versions of it. So cooperation is one sort of very basic way of thinking about it is that, you know, we agree to pursue a certain goal and abide by certain, you know, ways of doing that. So, you know, take sport. Okay, so two tennis players trying to beat each other, you know, it's the thing they want most in the world while they're playing tennis is to beat the other player. But they're cooperating at a certain level where they've made an agreement. We're going to play tennis. We're going to do it in a sporting fashion. We're going to follow the rules. We're going to agree to be held in check by the umpire. All of that, right? So it's highly cooperative on one level, but it's also very competitive on another level. Similarly, if you're in a work context where you have power dynamics, you know, what work context doesn't have power dynamics? People have different jobs and different roles. So that's perfectly compatible with having cooperation in that, you know, when people know to an appropriate or tolerable extent, they know their role, they're willing to carry it out. You know, you can have a lot of different opinion about what should happen or what could happen, but still it's cooperation in the sense that people are willing to be part of this sort of overall project. But I think a lot of what we've been discussing is that, you know, you want that to work in a way that does make everyone pleased to be there and valued and valuable in all of these respects. And so when things don't work well, even when things work terribly, you still have cooperation at some base level, but you know, just not the kind that we would really enjoy.
Yeah. And despite what most people would assume, that the single heroic business leader has never achieved anything in isolation. They are constrained by many things, including their own thought processes. And whether you're looking at modern business leaders or historic business leaders, everything was achieved in cooperation, even if it was who they were competing against. Back to the tennis analogy. So for many of us, we just need to be conscious of the more effective a cooperation will become is when we have a wider range of language to express what we're trying to achieve. And back to something Nick mentioned earlier on about fluency, many of us don't take the extra effort to understand a range of ways to describe a situation. We may describe it numerically, or we may describe it as a story, but we could describe it as a color, or we could describe it as a movie, or there are many techniques you could use to do that. So my invitation for those listening to us right now is, what can you do to increase the fluency with which you describe the kinds of problems you're trying to solve? What are the kinds of outcomes you're trying to work towards? If you can only express those ideas one way, it reduces the range of people who can come and understand the idea and support you in that. Because sometimes the support doesn't exist inside your organisation. It may be with regulators, it may be with governments, it may be with somebody overseas. And it's not to say, how do you make the idea simpler, but how do you have a range of ways to describe it rather than this single drumbeat all the time, because that's only going to appeal to your tribe. But you need more than your tribe to achieve the kind of success that they're trying for.
So you're talking to, goes back to who you're talking to is maybe you're talking to someone who's very data driven, or someone who is neurodivergent, and the people who find the ability to complete tasks the most would be the ones with the most amount of language, would you say?
For me, it's the range of language. So does that language make sense to a 5-year-old and a 55-year-old? Does that language make sense to someone where their home language and the language that's spoken makes sense? Does it make sense in singular outcomes or multiple outcomes? Does it make sense today and in a decade's time? Does it make sense today and a decade and a century into the future? So your range of being able to describe what you're trying to do will invite more people to cooperate with you to the outcome, which may result in a faster outcome, a higher quality outcome, a cheaper outcome. There's many different ways that language range can do that. And I think for many leaders who haven't studied rhetoric, for example, they are not as choiceful with their language as those who maybe have studied language to a slightly different fluency.
And I guess a lot of that as well, it would be reducing your biases as well, like of different types of people, being able to talk to all ages, all ethnicities.
I think types of people is only half of what you really need to think about, or maybe not, maybe less than half. So when you were suggesting before about thinking of types of people, I think what's more a higher priority, I think, is thinking about the context that we're in right now, which is, whatever it happens to be. So, what are we trying to do? What's the sort of frame of this situation? What goal do we have? All the rest of it. And you can have very different kinds of contexts with the exact same people. And so I think just because you're talking to the same person clearly doesn't mean you want to frame things in the same way in every context. So to my mind, you want to be mindful, obviously, of people's background and identity and these kinds of things to the extent that they really might determine, for example, the common ground that you have, things that might be important to take into account. But knowing who the other person is only part of what you really need to do. And it comes back to that question of sort of mindful use of language. You've got to study it really and think about, well, what works for what purpose? Not just what's appropriate to which type of person. It's a much more, it's not just a relation between two things. It's really between three things. It's a speaker and an audience and a situation or a kind of goal that we have. And so it's learning that to tailor to that sort of contextual dance in some sense. That's really the crucial thing. It's not easy, and I think some people find it more, maybe find it easier than others, or find it more natural than others. But it's like we say to our kids, it's you can learn it.
Yes, it's a learnt skill, and I think a lot of people will know somebody that they believe is a really effective, eloquent, articulate communicator. And that was like, it's so easy for them. Now you have no idea what went behind them getting to that step. For me, I reinforce with the executives I work with, all communication is situational, it's relational, and it's contextual. And if you don't think about those three parts of the dance, you're going to miss out on a lot of impact, because for a lot of the leaders I work with, their currency, the thing that matters most to them is time. Time is the resource they can't manufacture. And so for me, it's always, okay, let's calibrate this piece of communication around those three dynamics. And I would always say context is king or queen, depending on the situation of those three: situational, relational, and contextual, because the language you use frames it straight away. We could spend a lot of today talking about the neuroscience of listening, but it's not necessarily relevant to the language that your audience is used to, and it would cause some kind of dissonance for them. So I'm not here talking about the neuroscience of listening. Now, if I'm on a very academic discussion with somebody, that's going to be highly relevant, not just the neuroscience of listening, but what studies are you quoting when you're quoting the neuroscience of listening, and how has that evolved over multiple studies, and what's emerged in the field in recent years? Now, nobody's interested in that because I'm going to make a huge assumption that there's not a lot of academics listening to what you're publishing. But I did make a judgment that most of the people we're speaking to right now are listening in the context of a workplace.
Yeah. So lastly, we'll talk about, because another thing that you both mentioned in your books was tuning before a conversation. And I think this is, if we're talking about organizing a goal and finding the coordination and the agency to coordinate that goal and to be able to talk to different people, then tuning into their frequency. Is frequency a good word to use?
Could be. Could be. Depends on the context. I think
What is tuning?
There's for me, there's multiple tuning dimensions. So most people will think about tuning through frequency tuning, whether that's an orchestra that's about to play or a band that's tuning its instruments. So there's the tuning that happens for you, there's the tuning that happens for them, and there's the tuning that happens for us. So you just used one of those tuning phrases. You cued us and you said, finally.
Yeah.
And that was a deliberate and conscious choice on your part to frame this is the last part of the conversation we're going to have. So
just in case you were checking your watches and you're like,
I think neither of us are wearing them. But back to tuning is that from a listening perspective, the first person you need to listen to is not the speaker. The first person you need to listen to is yourself. So a lot of people don't tune themselves into the context in which they're arriving. They have the last meeting in their mind. They have the next meeting in their mind. They have their phone sending them notifications, and even worse today, wristwatches that put the notifications within reach of your pulse. So for me, I just invite people to find a very simple ritual for them that makes sense. Is that listening to music? Is that drinking a glass of water? Is that standing up before you go into a video conference? Is that sitting down after your last meeting? Is it having a walking meeting rather than a seated meeting? These are all tuning techniques you can think about that most people don't, because they just default. They default their meeting to 1 hour in their calendar. They default the meeting to a video conference and off we go. But in those default choices, you don't realize that the 1 hour is set a context, the video conference is set a context. Think about tuning yourself first. How do I close the browser tabs in my mind so I can become present to the other person? Number two, when we're tuned for them, a really simple technique is what you've done today. You've laid out water for the guests. That could be a tuning technique for them, to grab a glass of water before we start. It just signals, okay, we're here, we're present, we're in a group. And then the third level of tuning is, are you tuning into what's happening in the conversation between all of us, or are you only tuning into the point you're trying to make?
Yeah.
So earlier on, I mentioned that people will reflect at different levels. I'll reflect from my perspective, or will I reflect on how I'm thinking about this? Or in this case, the third person we need to think about is the audience who are listening to us right now. And I'm reflecting about my use of language there, and that's how I'm tuning in as I go through my story. So that's tuning through 3 dimensions of tuning.
And what's your experience, especially with sort of other nations or animal world? Or
Yeah, so tuning. I mean, I tend to use the word calibration quite a lot, and I also talk about common ground quite a lot. And those two things are kind of what come to my mind when you raise that question. So, you know, it sort of really brings back some of the things we've discussed earlier about trying to make sure that there's an open and agreed upon kind of goal of what we're doing now, where we're going, like what's the task that we're engaged in here. And so that is a way of directing people's attention to the same thing. So that is a sort of, it's psychologically, there's this fundamental kind of capacity that humans have, which is sometimes referred to as joint intentionality or joint attention, where, you know, not only can we focus on the same object, but we can be aware that that two people are looking at the same thing. We share joy at seeing something with our child, or we can point something out to somebody that's fallen on the ground. We can share attention with them.
And that's a beautiful thing, being able to like have moments together, share a journey, share a task.
Absolutely. And we have this certain cognitive capacity to do that, which is quite rare. And language is a big part of how we bring that about. And so as we move into an interaction, it's really important to, you know, not only to be looking at the same object, but metaphorically to be doing that, in the sense that I want to kind of do a little bit of work at the beginning to make sure that we're aligned in terms of where we're going with all of this. And that to me is the key thing about tuning. So how do you do that? Well, you know, that's where kind of knowledge of who that person is comes into play. That's where knowledge of this context comes into play. I'm trying to use the limited time I have to grab onto a few relevant things and kind of, you know, bring them to attention. So if you're opening an interaction with some things that people might call small talk, you know, that's not for no reason. You know, that's partly about putting people at ease and so forth, but it's not just scratching or something. It's got content. We don't ask people random questions. We ask people things that we want to be able to refer back to later on, right? That help us to see, well, what references might I be able to make? So oftentimes we'll ask about kids. Then we know we have kids of a certain age, or grandchildren, or whatever it may be. Then we've got something we can kind of refer back to. So all of those things, I think, come under what I would call common ground. And the thing about common ground is that you don't know whether you have it or not until you've sort of extracted it. So we might be, you know, enthusiastic about some sport or some art or something. We don't know it yet because we haven't got to know each other well enough yet, you know.
Yeah.
So pulling that stuff out is not just a random bit of kind of ice breaking. It's really part of sort of bringing out something where we can see a connection, not just superficially or gratuitously, but actually for helping us to achieve this goal that we both are here to try and achieve. So yeah, I guess that would be my way of trying to think about tuning in terms of calibration and common ground for a certain purpose.
And underrated probably in the business world.
Well, I'm not sure about the business world. I think
finding common ground.
I think people, you know, people find in everyday life, people are very tuned into common ground and they find it very important. But we can always do better. And I imagine in the business world, you know, that's where you're out of your personal relationships and you're into other kind of relationships. And it's not the kind of thing you learn. You spend as much time doing. So presumably I would expect in the business world that's where you need more to work on it.
Yeah, and there's an entire hospitality industry built around that, whether that's restaurants or going to sporting events or going to an art gallery or going to the Olympics or Formula One, and all those things are constructed for business people to be in relationship around something that's common, and that's where business gets transacted. It may get procured somewhere else, but that's where it's actually transacted. And when global leaders meet, whether that's BRICS or G7 or OECD or whatever collective of political leaders happen, it's curated in the context of, I'll play music that will bring them to commonplace. They don't just go straight into the talk. There are days of pre-days before a G7 or a G20 summit where there are a whole group of underlings working on a common outcome together. But that is because it's coming together collectively, and those people, whatever level they're at, are going to get more done together because they have something in common. You know, it's no surprise that Joe Biden met Xi Jinping in 2012, and they actually have a personal relationship, which is incredibly rare for a global leader to have a relationship with the head of China. Has he got more or less done? I don't know, but compared to his predecessors, he has a personal relationship and they have some common ground. Their common ground, they discovered basketball. Right?
Yeah.
So these things are the lubricants of communication, the commonality.
Fascinating. So, like, can we like summarize a few things for people to think about?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say would be to reiterate a theme that's come up a couple times for me, and that is that when I speak to people about communications, and oftentimes if it relates to business or to applications of knowledge around language, people use different ways of sort of trying to draw this out, but they might say something like, well, what are your tips? What are your top tips?
Yeah.
What's the...
Could you rephrase that?
What should I do? What should
What's
I
the
say?
5-word version?
Yeah, and I often find it difficult, and more these days I'm beginning to kind of push back against that as a thing that one couldn't even do, and I don't really tend to offer tips in this way, because my key it's like, well, how do I become, a top, first grade tennis player or whatever it is? Well, it takes a lot of hard work and study. It takes a lot of thinking carefully, looking back on the experience that you just had that didn't go the way you wanted, and figuring out what went wrong and why did that happen.
Yeah.
So it's like any other thing in life that you've got to work hard at, you've got to study it, and you've got to basically learn lessons and think about, well, what are those lessons such that I don't keep making those mistakes again.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean when I talk about mindfulness in language use. Well, you can't be mindful with something unless it's in your mind and you know what you're working with. So it requires, mindfulness is the sort of state of using something in a way that is intentional. And that's what I would want to see people doing with language. But to get to that, you have to study it. You've got to think, what's working, what's not working, what are the contexts in which it works, what are the contexts in which it doesn't work. So it's reflection afterwards that allows you to then mindfully apply in the future. So my tip or trick is, work hard and study the thing that you're trying to master.
That's beautiful. Any final? I'll change my question a bit for Oscar. Any final words from you, Oscar?
I think rather than the tip is to think about a question, because questions can be used context independent, whereas a tip that you give will only be relevant to specific contexts. So a lot of people with these listicles, 5 things, it's like, that's great, except in these situations. And to me, what always distinguishes an expert from somebody who thinks they're an expert is in what context does this not work, and put a line around that. So for me, all my stuff is about listening in the workplace. Do not go and try this at home with your loved ones. My question always is, if you're in relationship with somebody, and maybe even if you're not, depends on the power differential. The question I get my tribe to work on. So we have this concept of a deep listening ambassador community where they're all trying to make each other better when it comes to listening. And they've come back to this question all the time, and it seems to be context independent. What would make this a good conversation? So this is a process question. It's not actually a content question. And it's not what would make this a good conversation for you. It's because the conversation is shared. What would make this a good conversation? They'll say This will make it a good conversation, which is then your invitation to say, and a good conversation for me would be. And what we're doing then is creating that shared or that common experience through the calibration of the question we just asked. So rather than trying to search for that dart we can hit the bullseye with, I think the question, what would make this a good conversation, try it with people you have a high trust relationship with first, and you will start to see what's comfortable for you and when it's not. But that dials both of us or the group, if there's more than two of us in the conversation, into what's the shared experience we want to have through this communication, not just the shared outcome.
Yeah.
And the beauty of this question is it's a calibration tool, and we talk about a listening compass, so you're listening north, south, east, and west. Every 10 to 15 minutes, I can check in and say, hey, at the beginning of the conversation, you said this would be a good conversation. How are we going? And they'll say, we're going terrible, we're way off track, or we're going well, we can cut the meeting short. I think sometimes tips are overrated. Sometimes a question can be context independent. Seek the question that may be helpful for you to calibrate a common insight.
Beautiful. And thank you so much for coming down. This might be, I think this is a two-parter now. If you guys have got any insights from that, I would love to hear. I'd love to start a conversation to find out what you gained from that, and see where that leads. You guys both have fabulous books. Do you want to give the title and where they can buy?
Well, the book you've been referring to is called Language versus Reality, and the subtitle is Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. It's available on anywhere you get books online, I would say, published with MIT Press.
Beautiful.
And mine, simple, How to Listen, Discover the Hidden Key to Better Communication.
By Oscar. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for listening.